Following the selfless sacrifice of Alarielle, generations of Everqueens shone as the brightest light of the elves through calm and peril. One daughter after another, the Everqueens were given the godly wisdom to guide their people, and eventually pass it on to their offspring when their time came to an end. In an ever-changing world, corruption and darkness never got a hold of the line of the Everqueen, for each of the mighty mages remained true to Issa's legacy. Many thousands of years after Alarielle's passing, the darkness and havoc of chaos returned to Ulthuan in a vengeful fury. The Everqueen at the time felt the coming tribulations for her people, while a faceless fear nested in her heart. Yet she found a peace of serenity, knowing that her daughter was well hidden and the lineage of the Everqueen was protected with her. As the Elven tradition demanded, the Everqueen in line, a golden-headed maiden named Alarielle, had been taken away from her mother to be raised in secrecy. Alarielle, still young in Elven years, had yet many ages ahead of her to learn and grow into the spiritual leader she was destined to become. However, as each passing day turned more worrisome than the last, the once faint whisper of a great war grew only louder. Soon it was obvious that Alarielle's time as the next Everqueen would arrive quicker than anyone anticipated, and her crowning would coincide with the beginning of a terrible invasion, the likes of which were not seen since the turbulent times of the Sundering, when the Druki were separated from their kin, marking the perpetuation of the ongoing rivalry between the Dark Elves and the High Elves. As the scheme of the Chaos Gods finally unveiled by the gathering of an enormous army of destruction, the Witch King knew his patiently awaited time had come. Malekith sent his deadliest champion to Ulthuan, and entrusted him with infiltrating the High Elf Society under the false identity of a noble prince. Cruel beyond comprehension, and famed for his superior skills, the assassin Urian Poisonblade was the embodiment of death itself. His cunning and manipulative ways enabled him to gain the trust of many important figures of the High Elf Society against all odds. Although Urian secretly came to enjoy his prestigious life among the trusting High Elves, he knew it had to end. The Dark Elf said his farewells to his carefree life in Ulthuan in silence, and poisoned the Everqueen in cold blood. A foul and malevolent act. The murder of the Everqueen was to rip out the heart of the Elven nation and cut off their life force. Without her, the elves would fall into despair and become vulnerable, posing less of a threat to the domination of dark forces. As the shock and sorrow spread, the coming doom upon the world dawned even on the most ignorant. Death was coming for the living. Chaos was finally unleashed. The entire world was facing the threat of the numerous armies of the ruinous powers that had been moving south from the Chaos Wastes. Following the Ever-Chosen of Chaos, hundreds of thousands of wretched followers were marching towards the Empire to strike at the heart of the world of man. Drums of war sounded across all lands and provinces of the old world. Simultaneously in Ulthuan, and led by the Witch King himself, the Dark Elves were joined by a plague fleet of Nurgle, and set sail to the island to get rid of the High Elves once and for all. Through an unholy alliance, the Dark Elves were bolstered by tribes of Chaos Marauders and Warriors of Chaos. Malekith and his Chaos allies sank many ships of Ulthuan's navy out into the wild seas. Soon the Dark Army successfully invaded the Blighted Isles and took back Nagaryth. At last, Malekith had set foot upon his birthlands and sent his troops on a rampage upon the usurpers who banished them many thousand years ago. Alarielle's crowning as the new Everqueen came to pass exactly at this terrible time. With her mother murdered in cold blood at the hands of the assassin Urien Poisonblade, and her people on the brink of eradication, the young Everqueen was suddenly given the heavy burden of saving the elves against the overwhelming odds. It was now she who was to guide their nation and rekindle hope that had grown so weak in their land. Within her, Alarielle carried the power of nature and light, yet the source of life she was given was dependent on the fate of the world. The stronger Chaos Gods became, the more her strength waned. The Witch King knew the Everqueen had to be annihilated to ensure his ultimate domination of Ulthuan. The armies of the Dark Elves and the hordes of Chaos creatures burned and pillaged Avalon in search for the Everqueen, leaving a trail of death and blood-stained lands behind them. When the encampment of Alarielle was finally found in the depths of the ancient forest, Prince Tyrion, the descendant of Narration and the most famed warrior of their age, was at the Queen's court. In a hurried frenzy, the maiden guard of the Everqueen gathered and clashed with their attackers, fighting fiercely to protect the Everqueen. In desperation, Tyrion quickly dragged the Everqueen out of her pavilion and cleared them a path of escape through the Dark Elf forces with all his might. Although his desperate plan was successful, Tyrion was badly wounded by the cursed blade of a witch elf. As the pair disappeared behind the thick cover of the forest, a long chase began. The rumors claimed Tyrion and Alarielle dead, yet the Witch King was determined to see the end of Isha's lineage, and he was most certainly not meaning to leave it to chance. The Witch King summoned 4 master assassins and tasked them with finding the remains of the Everqueen. His intention was to hang her body upon his banner as the army marched towards the Elven kingdoms. He would display the Everqueen's ruined body to her people and let hope give way to desperation and fear. While the rest of Ulthuan was buried in grief upon hearing the supposed death of Alarielle and Tyrion, one elf refused to believe their passing. Teclis, the twin brother of Tyrion and the sorcerer of the White Tower, felt certain that his brother was alive and within his reach. The invisible thread that bound them since the day of their birth was yet unbroken, so there was still hope. As he prepared for his departure from the White Tower to seek Tyrion, he was gifted the War Crown of Sapphire by the High Lawmaster of the High Elves to aid him in his coming quest. The pair's tracks were being followed by the assassins through the forest, and at last, the hunters were led right to the Everqueen. As the Dark Elves burst through the branches, Tyrion jumped to his feet to fight them. His wound had weakened him, and a long chase had worn him out, yet Tyrion charged at their pursuers with firm determination. The Elven warrior cut them down one by one, but unfortunately, not before the last of them sent a message to Malekith of their discovery. The Witch King was beyond pleased upon hearing the conditions in which the fugitives were hiding. Trapped within the burning forests of Avalon and the armies of Chaos, the pair had nowhere to go. Malekith summoned the greater demon Nakari and sent him to hunt down the Everqueen. The Keeper of Secrets was eager for the chase, for he remembered the taste of such a high-being soul from the last time. Back in the forest, Tyrion was feverish and drained of his strength as the poison from the witch's blade conquered more of his body. With the chaos getting stronger by each and every victory upon the Elven realm, Alarielle's magical powers were dwindling away, and healing the cursed wound was now beyond her capability. Too often, the searching enemies were closing in, and few were the places that could shelter Alarielle from her seekers. Eventually, and after many efforts from the elves to stop the greater demon, Nakari finally found his prey in the forest. Tyrion was barely in the land of the living, yet he stood up to shield Alarielle one last time. It was the duty of any elven hero, yet more than that, it was the call of his heart, for he had been more than the warden of the Everqueen for some time. Chaos was ascendant, and Nakari swiftly sent Tyrion flying across the forest floor. There was nothing between death and the Everqueen. She who kept the power of Isha within could banish such a demon from their world at the height of her strength. Yet the terrible shadow had covered the light for far too long, and Alarielle was exhausted. As she gave in and awaited the cold grasp of death, the sky was abruptly pierced by a lightning bolt above the demon. Confused and overwhelmed, Alarielle thought she saw Tyrion emerging from the shadows of the trees and coming in between her and the Chaos Monster once again. Yet it was not Tyrion, but Teclis, who, after having looked for the pair for weeks long, had finally located them. Although still young at the time, the mage's magic was so epic that it forecasted the legendary sorcerer he would soon come to be known across the world. Their clash was quite short-lived, since Teclis was at his fittest and was equipped with the enchanted powerful weapons from the White Tower. With a gigantic blast of energy, the demon was engulfed in blue flames and shot back to the Chaos Realms altogether. Alarielle and Teclis stood beside the badly hurt Tyrion as Teclis chanted a healing spell he had learned in the White Tower. Hanging at the edge of nothingness, Tyrion heard the voice of his brother calling out to him and followed it back to the light. After Alarielle and Tyrion gathered their strength, Teclis led them to the shores of the Inner Sea, where the survivors of the Queen's Guard awaited their coming. The white ship then swiftly sailed to the Muri-Infinival Plain of Safari, where the last battle of the Age of Vengeance was to be fought. Too long were the elven warriors scattered across Ulthuan, having to fight a guerrilla war against the crushing forces of Chaos and Nagaroth. The day had finally come for them to gather under one banner for their final stand. The fate of their race would be revealed in the open plains of the marshlands. With the Phoenix King's siege within Lothern, it was up to Alarielle to rally their people and give them the courage to fight against the dark. Seeing their Everqueen alive and having her presence amongst them spread a wave of unlikely joy through the ranks of the High Elves. The odds were greatly against them, yet it mattered not. The elves of all the kingdoms had journeyed across war-ridden, destroyed lands to fight and die, a glorious death right there in the battlefield. The battle turned into hell quickly as mayhem ensued, and the piles of dead bodies began to rise. At the center of the field, a reinvigorated Tyrion became a living legend, and a reflection of Anarion himself, fighting the Dark Elves by the dozens, and killing them with swift blows and parrying incoming attacks, all while Teclis engaged in a great magic duel against the black art of the Witch King himself. Thousands of chaos demons, ravenous for the elven souls, crossed to the mortal world and filled up the atmosphere. With the coming of the demons, the High Elves were set to die there, eventually being overwhelmed against almost impossible odds. Alarielle collected all her power and set off an enormous wave of bright light that travelled across the field, banishing hordes of chaos demons from the mortal planes back again into the warp. With the strong magic she had spent, Alarielle's energy was diminished. Queen's handmaidens swiftly carried her unconscious body away from the havoc to safety, where she could be nursed back to health. With many of the demons cast away, Teclis could focus his fight almost solely on the Witch King. With the blessing given to him by Lilith, he eventually managed to banish Malekith and turn the tide against Chaos and the Dark Elves. It was also during this battle that the death of the previous Everqueen was avenged. The arrogant Urian Poisonblade, ever so oblivious to his own flaws, challenged Tyrion to a duel that lasted for an entire hour. Their skills were almost matched, and it seemed impossible for any one of them to gain the upper hand. At the end, it was Tyrion who struck down the Dark Elf with a well-placed attack and sent him to the world of the dead. After this significant battle that ended with victory for the High Elves, Alarielle the Radiant rode to many more battles where she was needed across Ulthuan. Although cherished by the masses, much of her people dissented her active role in the army, which traditionally was that of the Phoenix King. The Everqueen was to be the spiritual leader of their race, the peaceful and the gracious one, who steered away from violence and war. However, with the Phoenix King Finubar locked into his tower following a mysterious agenda, Alarielle had little choice but to take his place. She was a caring and gentle spirit as an Everqueen, but also fierce and wild as a warrior who did not hesitate to condemn the corrupted. This undeniably combative side of hers was interpreted as a sign that the goddess Isha herself was turning more warlike. Whether her actions were traditional or not, one thing is for certain. As long as Alarielle the Everqueen breathes life, she will be a nightmare to all who mean harm to the Elven realms.
On this channel, we are putting together narrative Total War cinematic battles and Warhammer lore videos. A special thank you goes to our Patreon supporters who help us in the making of more content. You can also join Patreon and earn extra perks while supporting the videos to come. Find the link in the description below. Make sure to subscribe, and thank you for watching. See you on the next one.